Where organisms living on Earth today have come from a long history of thought. The famous Greek philosopher Plato thought that all organisms on Earth was created in a perfect form by a creator. He claimed that every organism was an example of a perfect type. He did acknowledge that organisms may deviate slightly from this perfect type, but argued that the variations within a group of organisms was really unimportant. In addition, he thought that all species were unchanging throughout time. Aristotle also believed that species were fixed, that they didn't change through time. However, he believed that the Creator created some species that were better than other species. Aristotle ordered the types of organisms known at the time into a linear scheme called the Great Chain of Being, and it was based on the size and complexity of the organisms, of course with humans up top. This philosophy predominated the thought process of philosophers well into the 18th century. This typological thinking eventually began to break down when Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was the first to formally propose a theory of evolution. In this theory, he argued that species in fact do change throughout time. He did adopt the framework of Aristotle. He argued that there is a great chain of being. However, Lamarck argued that organisms evolve and move up the ladder through time. He thought that organisms spontaneously generate as simple organisms at the base of the chain and move up. In this way, Lamarck argued that evolution was progressive, meaning it always led to more and more complex organisms. What makes Lamarck's idea so unique is not only did he argue that organisms change through time, he also provided a mechanism that he thought caused this change. This mechanism is known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. This mechanism suggests that organisms' physical characteristics change as they develop in response to challenges posed by their environment, and then they pass those physical traits on to their offspring. In other words, Lamarck thought that the physical characteristics a person required in life would be passed on to their offspring. So if you lifted weights your whole life, your child would be more likely to come out looking like a bodybuilder. But lifting weights wasn't very fashionable in the early 19th century, so the example Lamarck used was the giraffe. Lamarck argued that the randomness exists in all populations, so there are giraffes with short necks and some with long necks. But he was also the first to formally suggest that those most fit to survive were more likely to reproduce. However, Lamarck suggested that the reason the giraffe's neck is so long is that some giraffes were able to stretch their necks a little bit longer than others in order to reach the higher vegetation, and subsequently those giraffes passed on their longer necks to their offspring. But this idea didn't really hold on very long, and Darwin was really the first one to challenge it.
Nothing about the young Charles Darwin suggested that he would grow up to be the sort of man who would change our view of the world. He loved hunting and beetle collecting far more than his formal studies. In fact, the young Darwin dropped out of medical school much to the disappointment of his father, Robert Darwin, a doctor. Darwin finally managed to complete a course of study for the ministry at Cambridge, but he never served in a church. An around-the-world trip on a refitted warship, the Beagle, changed his calling. Darwin expected to travel for 2 years. Instead, he spent 5 years exploring and collecting and observing. The Galapagos Islands proved the most important stop on his voyage. Darwin observed that various species of tortoises and finches differed from island to island. He didn't realize the significance at the time, but the observations and his collections would eventually lead him to the theory of natural selection. In 1836, Darwin came home with enough material to provide him with years of work. 3,000 pages of notes, over 1,500 species of insects, 4,000 skins, bones, and dried specimens, and crates full of fossils. At 27, Darwin made cautious steps toward marriage. On a piece of paper, he recorded his reasons for and against the institution. On the plus side, he wrote, children and someone to take care of the house and companionship. And better than a dog, anyhow. The negatives included the loss of freedom and less money for books. But Darwin talked himself into marriage with Emma Wedgwood, saying, "I shall never know French or see the continent or go to America or go up in a balloon. Oh, never mind, my boy, there's many a happy slave." Darwin fathered 10 children and rarely left his home near London, but he never lost the freedom of his imagination. He wandered his estate, pondering questions that his voyage and simple truths about breeding farm animals suggested. He wrote 3 hours a day. For 20 years, Darwin wrestled with the concept of evolution and natural selection, fully aware that his ideas would outrage those who believed that God was responsible for all creation. He started with the familiar. For hundreds of years, people have been selectively breeding faster horses. Darwin called the process artificial selection. Our English horses, he said, differ from horses of every other breed, but do not owe their difference and superiority to descent from any single pair, but to a continued and selective breeding and training of many individuals during each generation. Darwin's book on the origin of species went on to tackle natural selection. In the real world, random genetic changes may improve an individual's ability to survive. Those individuals with traits best suited for the local environment will, on average, leave the greatest number of surviving fertile offspring. The book sold out on the first day of publication and changed the way we look at life. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection has become the unifying concept for biology. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved.
When Darwin began his life's work, geologists were just beginning to assemble and interpret the fossil record. From this record, Darwin was puzzled as to why some fossils represented species that no longer exist on Earth. And this puzzled Darwin because it was proof that these species at some time did exist. So where did they go? Also at the same time, some fossils of the same species were being discovered on completely different continents, from South America, Africa, and even Australia. And these were species that were incapable of crossing oceans. How did that happen? At the same time, a scientist named Alfred Wegener proposed that this was evidence that the continents were at one point connected. And this severely challenged Charles Darwin's religious dogma that dictated the Earth was only several thousand years old. So he set on a life journey in order to figure out where new species come from. Of the first organisms to drive Darwin's curiosity were several species of finches in the Galapagos Islands. When he was 24, Darwin paid to be a naturalist on a ship, the HMS Beagle, that was to circumnavigate the world. On this trip, they stopped for several weeks on the Galapagos Islands. These islands are 600 miles away from the mainland of South America, and that's a very far distance for any animal to travel. And he visited several islands while in the Galapagos and collected many specimens of animals. But it was the finches that took his eye. He began to notice that the finches from different islands were different, but similar. Many of them looked the same, but had different beak shapes and sizes. He surmised that all these species must have come from a common ancestor, and that the differences in beak shape must be due to the differences in food sources on the specific islands. And this is where Darwin's idea that natural selection caused speciation was born. Charles Darwin, however, began to think of evolution not as happening to individuals, but rather to entire populations. Darwin claimed that instead of variation within a population to be unimportant, it was actually the key to understanding how new species were generated. And this is known as a population thinking, and it is in contrast what was known as typological thinking, championed by Plato and Aristotle. And his gift to the world was the theory of natural selection. He thought that new species were selected by a natural process, and he argued that the variation in physical traits of populations were at the heart of this process. Organisms in a population all differ in their ability to survive and reproduce, and this is known as an organism's fitness. And all organisms have certain physical traits that determine how well they can get food, defend themselves from predators, and the ability to reproduce. So how would Darwin describe the giraffe's neck? Well, he argued that in past generations had variability in neck lengths, and that giraffes with longer necks had greater fitness and their ability to acquire vegetation from higher up trees. So those giraffes with the longer necks were also more able to reproduce because they could acquire more vegetation. So in other words, subsequent generations would have longer necks because those most fit to survive had longer necks. Darwin definitely deserves the credit he is given for developing the theory of natural selection. In fact, there are only two theories in biology, natural selection and cell theory. However, the story of Darwin is incomplete without mentioning the scientist 2 decades younger than Darwin, Alfred Wallace. Wallace was always fascinated with Darwin's work and frequently corresponded with Darwin by letter. During the latter part of Darwin's life, Wallace sent a letter to Darwin outlining a theory of how new species came to be. It was so shocking to Darwin that it forced him to set his concerns about how the church would respond to his writing and publish his magnum opus, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And in fact, he had been sitting on this publication for nearly 25 years for fear of the church's response. Wallace didn't invoke all the mechanisms of natural selection and the method of speciation that Darwin came up with. He did propose that species were created predominantly by environmental pressures such as droughts, floods, fires, and other extreme natural events. And what he didn't have was data. All science is based on evidence, and Darwin had been amassing evidence his entire life to support this theory. Wallace and Darwin co-authored a short paper outlining their theory of natural selection, and Darwin shortly thereafter published On the Origin of Species. This theory was revolutionary for several reasons. Going against Plato and Aristotle, they argue that species are not unchanging through time. Lamarck also argued this, but unlike Lamarck, they argued that changes in species are not linear, nor are they progressive, always becoming more and more complex. Darwin-Wallace also broke from thinking about how species change from thinking about populations rather than individuals. But perhaps the most important component of their theory of natural selection was that it was more than philosophical, it was scientific. The difference is that the scientific method makes predictions that can be tested through experimentation, and the theory of natural selection can do this. Darwin didn't like to refer to his theory as evolution, because it implies a directional pattern to the process, indicative of the great chain of being. He referred to this process as descent with modification. Darwin's descent with modification makes few claims. First, it suggests that current species came from ancestral species. In other words, a current species descended from an ancestral species. He also argued that slight changes happen over time. In other words, species are modified through time. Descent with modification. Just to review, we can summarize Darwin's theory of natural selection into 4 postulates. First, physical traits vary in a population. So there's some giraffes with short necks, some with long necks, and some with medium-sized necks. Those physical traits are passed down from generation to generation. So if both your parents are short, you'll probably be short too. Darwin was not aware of this mechanism, however. It took the work of an Austrian monk to figure this one out. His name is Gregor Mendel, but more on him later. Darwin also noticed through his observations of nature that far more offspring are produced than can survive. So he inferred that the members of these species must be competing for a limited amount of resources. And the logical conclusion that stems from that sort of competition is that those most fit are more likely to survive and reproduce to the next generation. So where's the proof? There are several pieces of evidence that support that species change through time. Through the dating of meteorites, our best guess is that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, and the earliest signs of life occur in the geological record after about 1 billion years. This suggests that life have been present on this planet for nearly 75% of its lifespan. I think that's pretty amazing. However, it's the fossil record that provides the proof. Many fossils represent extinct species, such as this extinct Irish elk. And Darwin knew of these fossil specimens similar to this and concluded that species must be dynamic, not static. And recent evidence actually suggests that over 99% of the species that have ever existed on Earth no longer are here. Darwin proposed that in order for his idea of descent with modification to be supported, that there must exist a series of fossils that represent transitional forms between early and late forms of a physical trait. In other words, if it is expected that a recent species came from a more ancestral species, Darwin would expect there to be an intermediate species, and we see this in the evolution of the horse. And we also see intermediate forms in the evolution of the whale. We have fossil morphologies for species that go from aquatic to terrestrial, as well as some intermediate examples. Darwin would argue that this suggests that whales gradually transitioned from terrestrial to aquatic organisms, and the geological record supports this. And whales also have vestigial legs. Vestigial traits are reduced structures in organisms that serve no function, but they can be more supporting evidence of evolutions. Whales have several bones in their hindquarters that serve absolutely no function. They do, however, resemble the leg bones of other organisms thought to be closely related to the whale. And in fact, there are very reduced femur and tibia bones in whales. This is additional evidence that these animals came from four-legged creatures. It's very difficult to see evolution in action, especially in organisms that have long lifespans, like humans. We have seen evidence in organisms with really short lifespans, however. We've seen bacterial species that were easy to manage 40 years ago evolve to resist these same drugs that we use to treat them. The MRSA strain of the staph bacteria is a perfect example of this. It was an easy infection to treat in the beginning of the antibiotic revolution. However, the staph bacteria was not completely wiped out, and a resistant bacteria multiplied over several generations, eventually creating a strain that is no longer susceptible to be able to be controlled by antibiotics. So please be very careful when taking antibiotics and follow your doctor's instructions. Don't take antibiotics for viral infections like the flu, and when you do take antibiotics, take the complete length of the dosage, even though you feel better after just a few days. Homologies are similarities in species from a common ancestor. One of the most commonly known homologies are the structural homologies in the limbs of vertebrates. Nearly all vertebrates have the same basic bone structures in their limbs, regardless if they swim, trot, grasp, or fly. Vertebrates also have developmental homology. This is when the developing embryos have similarities among them, even though they're as different as a chicken and a human. Did you know that humans have gills and tails when they're in development? Pretty weird, huh? And today we can also look at their genetic homology. We can compare how similar different species are with respect to their DNA sequence. And the theory is that the closer two species' DNA sequences are to each other, the closer related they are. Peppered moths are a fabled example of how natural selection can be seen in action. Peppered moths are a species that has variation in their coloration from white with gray speckles to completely black. These are really common in Northern Europe, especially England, and exist in oak forest. And before the Industrial Revolution, most of these variants were light-colored, and this is because they could attach themselves to the oak tree during the daytime and remain concealed from their predator, birds. However, during the Industrial Revolution, it was noted that dark-colored variants were more common. This has been attributed to the change in their environment. The burning of coal during the Industrial Revolution produced a tremendous amount of soot, which collected on the bark of the trees. So, as a population, those peppered moths that were darker in color became more fit and were more able to survive and reproduce than their lighter cousins. This is natural selection in action. Evolution is a complicated subject, and sometimes understanding what something isn't helps us to understand what it is. Evolution is not goal-oriented. There is no evolutionary mastermind whittling away at organisms in order to produce a perfect being. Evolution is not typological, as was argued for centuries. This means it doesn't happen to the individual. Rather, it happens to populations over time. And lastly, evolution is not progressive. Aristotle and Lamarck definitely thought this. They thought that evolution tended to favor more advanced organisms. Rather, evolution favors those most suited to their environment. And in fact, sometimes evolution favors simpler organisms. And some traits are even lost in certain animals, like the hind limbs in whales.